Good morning. My name is Colonel Lance Patterson. Welcome back after your two plenary sessions, and also I suspect a welcome coffee break. I think some really thought-provoking content this morning, and it's generated some interesting questions that we can discuss. I think that the first thing I need to do is to introduce the panel, and they're essentially split into three groups. So if the first group are sort of senior officers and officials who work for General James Swift, who you saw on video this morning. And these are Rear Admiral James McLeod, who's the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff in charge of personnel capability. You've just heard from Adrian Dottridge, who leads on transformation. And you have General Simon Brooks-Ward, who is the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff, Reserves and Cadets. So welcome to that group. And the other military element is Brigadier Lee, who you've already heard from, who is the Chief of Staff of Standing Joint Command and has all that experience of actually reacting to the pandemic militarily. And then we have a team that is drawn from industry and commerce. So I'd just like to introduce William Nonovo, who is the Senior Operations Manager at World Fuel Services. Caroline Logan, who's the Programme Director at Buildforce. And Matt Hubbard, who's kindly joining us from Lloyd's Banking Group. So a warm welcome to the panel, and thank them in advance for giving up so much of their time today. I think there's some really interesting questions, and I think they're grouped into a number of areas. Some built around the relationship through the covenant and employer recognition. Some focused on where we go with reserves, mindful of what we've learned through the pandemic, and a third group seems to be now focusing on how the terms and conditions of service and the relationship might work again as we move out of the pandemic and into some new structures within the integrated operating capability, etc. So I think the first question I have is, how do you think industry and defence can work together better to create resilience? So how do you think industry and defence can work together better to create greater resilience? And I think that it'd be useful to hear from somebody from the private sector first. So Matt Hubbard, I wondered if you could give us a start off on that answer, please.
Certainly, Lance. I think we can certainly learn more from how the armed forces build resilience. I mean, our reservists and veterans bring some of that training and skill into the workplace. More broadly, I think, and part of resilience, I think sharing mutual challenges that we face currently and will face in the future is important, whether that's around leadership, adaptability, flexibility, breadth of skills, embracing and investing in the digital capability that we need for the future means that I think we've got a lot that we can learn from each other. I'd also say that we at Lloyd's, we've got around 64,000 armed forces customers, and we listen regularly to their unique insight and ideas to meet their requirements as well. So I think it is around dialogue and openness, and conferences like this and other dialogue that we have, I think, helps that.
Any other panelists want to come in support of that?
If I may, Lance, I think it's a really interesting question here. And when we talk about resilience, certainly from a World Fuel Services perspective, it's about resilience more globally. And given our communities of veterans of the company in North America, here in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, alongside our veterans community, our sense is that resilience is about the power of your networks. And so I think what we would say in looking at this is resilience in terms of generating agility, tempo, ability to respond to crisis domestically or overseas really does come down to the strength of your relationships between industry and the military, and having a much more transparent basis for that, and creating greater trust. And indeed, there was a Serco Institute report out on this at the end of last year. So I think we may come back to this, but I think to generate greater resilience, we've got to find a way to create those relationships that are strong, open, based on trust.
Rear Admiral McLeod.
Sorry, big fat fingers on a little touch screen. Absolutely agree with what's been said, and in the terms of, you know, the culture and the behaviours need to be there. But I would also add that you need the processes and the procedures to work as well, so you can actually make it happen. And I think we have to move forward on all of those fronts. We have to have that trust, as you say. We have to have people who want to do this, and then we have to make it easy for them so that you can move between the different sectors, and we can employ and you can employ those individuals with greater ease. And the way I sort of view it right now is we've got a series of stovepipes, whether you're a regular, a reservist, or you're in contract, you're in industry, and we kind of move in between those stovepipes. And that's not really effective where we need to be in the future. We need to have a spectrum where we can move people with much greater ease. So there are some mechanical elements we need to do around process and procedure, and understanding the skills that we need, that we can provide, that you need and you can provide. So I think there's a multifaceted solution that we need to move on to move this forward.
Thank you, sir. Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, Lawrence, if I could just come in, really do concur with what's been said previously, and picked up in particular from what Matt and Noel have said about the mutual benefit of sharing experiences between the armed forces and industry. Really, really important. And also what Nov said about the importance of networks. We have a phrase here, make friends before you need them. And I think it's really valuable in terms of understanding resilience. You know, our sort of vital ground, if you like, is the neural network that we have. You know, the liaison officers, the staff officers that we have deployed at the strategic level, at the regional, local levels. That's been hugely valuable. And those joint military commands that I mentioned, those 10 joint military commands, that relationship that we have with them and the relationships that they have within the local and regional areas has been hugely powerful, and that all plays into that resilience piece. So that's from a military perspective, but we continue to learn from our reservists who bring their own experiences into the game as well.
Thank you, Brigadier. I think there's a question, I think, which flows nicely from that. And I think this might well be fielded by Caroline in the first instance, because we've already talked about, you know, the construction of Nightingale hospitals, etc., and we've spoken about e-commerce. But you know, in terms of, you know, we are discussing defence and industry's joint approach, and perhaps the construction industry could provide some examples of this. So have you got, you know, ongoing examples from the construction industry that play into this space?
Yeah, well, actually, Billforce attended an event a few years ago where defence and industry were celebrating their joint efforts at Mulberry Harbour in World War II, which was a fantastic example of how far it dates back working together. And then, of course, more recently and very, very topical today is the building of the Nightingale hospitals, where we've seen defence and construction come together side by side, building these hospitals. And then more recently, of course, the testing centres and the immunisation centres. So we've incredible examples of unity and parallels between the two, and hence why we've been able to consistently work together in this time of need and for national security and resilience. And just to add, another reason why a lot of our service leavers are choosing construction as their second choice of career.
Anybody got anything to add on that from the panel? It's a concise answer. Thank you very much for that, Caroline. That seems to be to have answered that. The next quick question, I think, was how can UK Ministry of Defence better incentivise industry to support the employment of colleagues who are reservists? And I think, Nov, can I ask you if you've got an opinion on that, please?
Thanks, Lance. It just so happens that World Fuel Services has recently generated a think piece on this issue in the context of the whole force, and so we're really keen to sort of be an advocate for greater incentives for reservists in our companies. But I think there are two levels which I'd like to sort of tackle here. One is about the value of the individual to their employer, and then the second piece is really about the wider whole force piece. So in terms of the individual, what World Fuel Services would say is it's not necessarily about the financial benefits or compensation for reservists. It's about those circular benefits from the competences and skills they gain, that our reservists gain in military service, that they bring back to the company. And we've sort of heard about that already, although you could say it's been sort of one way. It's what is the reservist bringing from their company into the military sphere. And I think if we were able to provide a system where the benefits are certified, professionalized from military service, that is something that employers could certainly point to as direct benefits from reservists in the company. The second piece in terms of whole force, I think there's perhaps a wider story to tell about why companies or industries more broadly should support the whole force by design approach. And maybe this will come out more clearly in the integrated review, or maybe even in the Reserve Forces 2030 study review. But I think there's a piece there that, again, going back to the Serco Institute report last year, a really compelling narrative can still be made about why industry should be involved the whole force and therefore support reservists as well.
Certainly. Does anybody want to come in on that? Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind actually, Lance. Sorry, I think it's also about being prepared to try things. We're running a few trials. Some of you on this conference will be aware, particularly in the engineering space, where we're looking at how do we work better with the industry and at some areas with the aviation industry to bring people in to support us for a while, to take some of the flex that's currently in the market. We're also looking at how do we advertise some of the roles that we've got and really target into that technical space where we can really benefit from the skills that industry can provide, and do so in a way where there is a much more transparent and flow in and out of the system rather than it being a one-way door. And I think that there's some really interesting and really positive results coming from those trials. But it does need both parties to be imaginative and lean in and look at problems with how do we fix it rather than why we shouldn't do something. But I'm hugely infused by some of the work that's gone on in the supply fusion programs and the engineering redeployment trials that we're running with industry right now.
You're on mute, Lance.
That famous phrase of 2021. We had to have it. There's an interesting question come on about the inception of the review in a way. And the question is that the review seems army heavy, and there was a feeling that all such reviews are army heavy. And do we feel, therefore, that we are getting the right tri-service balance out of the recommendations? General Simon, you're the SRO for, I think, the drafting of the review. I don't know if you've got any comments, and I think the people of other cloths on the panel might have a view also.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. Well, as you can see, I'm wearing the cloth of the service that's being talked about in this, and I've been the SRO on Reserve Forces 30 for the past year, and I can tell you, and categorically tell you, that this is a tri-service and defence-wide review. There is no fear or favour against any one particular senior service. It just happens to be that the Army is the greatest contributor in terms of numbers to defence. but that doesn't mean to say in terms of capability and all the other bits that we have to put against this, that the other services don't contribute. And actually, if you have a look at, and I've looked at the review, and I'm sorry we can't release it today, but many of the good examples about how we should look forward as Reserve Forces 30 come from the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, in actual fact. So a lot of lessons were taken from those two services in the composition of the review. So I can give you that. The other bit I would say is that whatever we want to say about this, it is about whole force. And we talk about whole force the entire time. And we talked about it for 10 years. And what this review is setting out to do is not just talk about it, but actually implement it culturally and absolutely in stone within defence, because we cannot afford to do our business if we don't have this whole force mentality. And I talk to you as an employer. I am a reserve lifer. I've done 32 years in the reserves, but I'm also an employer of 30 people. So I get it in both terms, but in all of this, it's a whole force. It's not just about, it's about changing culture as well as everything else. But I can assure you, all three services equally represented in the review. Thank you.
Lance, can I add something more on that? So as someone unencumbered by cloth, it's I think one of the advantages I can bring is absolutely looking across all the three services completely equally in that regard, and certainly the relationships that I have already developed with the single services are absolutely equally strong across all three. And one of the things, coming into defence that's really struck me is the scrupulousness with which serving people working in main building in head office are in roles where they are absolutely taking a tri-service perspective for all their work day in and day out. Probably to a more surprising degree than some might expect, actually, but that's one of the things I've been really pleased to see, that irrespective of the particular colour of the uniform someone might be wearing, the lengths that are gone to ensure that it's absolutely looking across all three services with equality. And I will certainly make sure in terms of the implementation of the recommendations to continue to apply that principle.
I'll move on to another question. I think that's the contributions for that. There's a flow of questions that are starting to relate to sort of the employment of reserves in the future. The first question was, what do we envisage might be the future role of sponsored reserves within any RF 30 construct? Suspect this falls somewhere between Adrian and General Simon. General Simon, I know you've got views on high readiness reserves. Do you want to kick off?
I rather thought Adrian was going to take that one.
Well,
no,
please do.
I think we have a broad suite of terms and conditions and policies, and we can bring them to bear with certain agility, but we need to review them. And an HRR, high readiness reserve, is only one of the of those. And HRR to me is a flexible friend in terms of putting people on the ask or the demand list that can be used by defence at readiness. And with the full complicity of the employer. And I think that is the open and honest, transparent discussion between employer, the reservist, and defence. And as for sponsor reserves, we talk a lot about sponsor reserves. I mean, I think I'd like to expand it slightly wider than that. One of the questions I've seen is, what is the bridge between the reserve and industry or organisations? And the answer to that is that defence, as my friend Jim has just said, it's exploring all different options with organisations, but defence can't afford a number of capabilities, and it needs to cherry pick and pluck in those capabilities as we look forward, and that's certainly part of the RF30 work. certainly part of the sponsor reserves piece that Adrian's just talking about. But I think we're going to look at a broad range of these particular policies and usages. Adrian.
Yeah, I think the only things I'd add is that, so in terms of the narrow question of sponsored reserves and RF30, so they're within the overall scope of the review. But it's probably as much as I can say at this point that, you know, one of the questions that the review has been considering is what's the overarching framework for the reserves? You know, so trying to establish, you know, what will be the circumstances in which the answer to a particular defence task will be to look to the sponsored reserves, and trying to, you know, get that spectrum established for, you know, a wide range of tasks, and defining what are those tasks going to be in the future that the sponsor reserves might be the answer to. But also, you know, at a more fundamental level, you know, what the review is really trying to get after at a deeper level is how can defence further integrate itself and further strengthen the connections that we have with all parts of society. And obviously, as employers, you know, that's an absolutely key constituency. And one of the ways that we can do that, and indeed do that, is through sponsored reserves. So, you know, that's the general direction of travel I sense from the review, is that it really wants to, you know, encourage defence to think about what are the ways overall that we can, you know, further integrate together the role of defence with the everyday fabric of the nation. So yes, it's in there. In terms of the detail, we'll have to work through exactly how we might respond to any of the recommendations on there. Over.
Adrian, thank you. Anybody else, anything to add on that from the panel?
Okay. Please, Lance.
Yeah, sorry.
If I could, thank you. And I think we've focused on, because of the question, these sort of formalised categories: sponsored reserves, high readiness reserves. But there is another form of relationship, probably less formalised, more informal, which is where World Fuel Services is certainly coming from. We're open to a relationship with military reserve units that align with our core business. So those units in the space of fuel logistics. And the relationship with that will allow us to share best practice, support training, and, you know, on a case-by-case basis, potentially provide employment in our company. So I think when we do look at the relationship between industry, wider community, and the military reserves, there is another way we can build a relationship, as I've just touched on there.
Admiral Jim.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I absolutely agree, and it's the point about imagination is our limit on this, and there's some work we're doing in the logistics space, in the driving space, which is beneficial to us and beneficial to industry, which involves how do we use the skills that we've got at times that we don't need them to benefit our individuals, give them fulfilling careers, improve their training, and also add value, and they're doing the things they joined up to do, and it's a real win-win situation. And again, we're testing that through. There are a number of procedural, legal, and other elements that we're fighting through, but I'm really hopeful that we'll have that trial up and running soon. And if it wasn't for COVID, we would have been talking about the success of it now, I think. But absolutely, there's all sorts of opportunities for us. My part in the plan is to remove the policy and process blockers to enable us to move across that spectrum easily.
So thank you. If nobody's got anything to add on that, we've had quite an interesting one on are there any lessons that we are learning from the experiences of other nations where whole force concepts and industrial partnerships have been key to building military capability and civil resilience? So I think maybe a link there to some of the sort of Scandinavian work that we've been tracking. I think then that might fall to you, Adrian, but I might be wrong. So if anybody else feels that they can contribute. So the basic question is are we learning and absorbing lessons through the report from other nations?
Yeah, so I mean, it's probably as much as I can say is that, you know, having had the benefit, which you haven't had, of course, of looking through the material produced by the review, they were certainly one of the advantages of, you know, undertaking, you know, a full and thorough review is they do have the headspace to look at questions such as these, and I know that there are absolutely examples where they've been keen to, look at aspects of where things are, working well, and they will be challenging us to say, look, can we look at models such as X? And so they've absolutely had this headspace to do that research. And I'm sure closer to home as well, colleagues will be able to speak to, the ongoing engagements that we have with other countries. Will there be more that we can and should do? Absolutely. And I'm very well aware that for most cases and in most problems, in government or public sector, most things have already been tried. And I don't think government often learns enough from either examples from history or indeed examples of where other countries are adopting things. Of course, it always needs to be contextualized. No two countries, no two situations are identical. But that shouldn't mean that not invented here should also apply. So yes, absolutely. There's definitely some thinking that's been done as part of the independent review, and we'll want to use that learning to really challenge ourselves to look at other areas that we can adopt. Steal with pride, I think, should always be a motto that should apply in many areas of life, and this would certainly be one. Careful stealing with pride if there are things that work. Over.
Is there anything that you wish to add?
Lance, sorry, I know I seem to pop up second on most of these questions, but we've sort of noted a pretty interesting trend, particularly in the area of cyber capability in the military. So we've seen that the US, Israel, Estonia have actively sought talent from industry and brought those individuals or that capability into the reserves. And coming out of COVID and the lessons perhaps and observations about the importance of engineering, construction, logistics, it'd be really interesting to see how that might be drawn into the reserve capability for UK in that sort of model that we see in cyber elsewhere. I just offer that as an observation at this point, but it is in our think piece, which I said has been released earlier this week.
Thanks, Nob.
Just to add to that, Lance, as you know, I sit on the NATO Reserve Forces Committee, and I can say that there is a lot of work on all of this, on cyber, logistics, etc., across all the nations of NATO. And indeed, it's a really good benchmarking system there, and we cherry pick across this piece. And in particular, I like what the Bundeswehr is doing. I think it's very dynamic, and they are stretching themselves. The French are doing, again, in the cyberspace, they're very much into this with the reserves, and the Canadians themselves. But it is a question of cherry picking the best, as Adrian says, and not being too proud to ignore them.
You're on mute, Lance.
Yeah, thanks for that. The next question is drawn out from something that Minay said, I think, pointing out the reservists employed across the globe and also in the UK. And the question was whether we thought that the reserve effort would be much more focused on operations in the UK than on operations overseas. Any volunteers from the panel to comment on UK v worldwide engagement within the future construct?
I think that's for me to answer, actually, Lance. The answer is that a lot of focus over the last year has been put on resilience and the UK piece. Indeed, as we go through the RF30 piece, a lot of, as we've heard this morning, a lot of it is about resilience. And so we can be misguided, I think, in just thinking that that's all the reserve forces are going to do in the future. That is absolutely not the case. They still have, and we still have, a very military contingent capability, which is directed at warfighting as much as resilience. And so there is a balance to that. And the nice thing about, good thing about RF13, where we've come from in the last year, is that balance. And I think it's working well, and we can see it panning out into the future into a balanced way, which we can support both homeland resilience and also warfighting operations and contingent capability.
Thank you, sir. Looks done on that question. There's an interesting question about what we've seen during the pandemic, how civilian and commercial skills, and again, we've had a number of questions on this, have contributed to the military's planning and implementation of the nation's response. Is there work planned or ongoing to highlight the skills used that could show the benefits and that the way that they contribute to company fortunes? And I think there's a number of questions like that, but I think they're more about the route to market rather than the concepts. And I think I'd like to probably link it to another question: is that where companies and organizations feel that they wish to engage with defense, how do they actually go about that? Nov, you're nodding. Would you care to have a go at that?
I think that second part of your question, Lance, is really interesting. I think it is a challenge to open dialogue with the MOD, and I say this having only left the regular army 18 months ago, and I'm looking back in. But I think there is clearly protocols around public procurement that guide us. But again, I think coming out of the Serco Institute report and indeed in our own think piece, we would really encourage more forums or fora that allow industry and the military MOD to have these really innovative discussions about how we can do business together in different sorts of ways. At the moment, it seems really stovepiped with lots of gateways to get through. But again, that might change following the two big reviews that are pending. But I just offer that in terms of just highlighting some of the challenges we do have about having discussions out with the normal procurement process.
Anything to add from panelists? Okay. Sort of linked to that sort of element of, maybe mutual benefit. There was a good question, I think, about whether any improved TACOS were planned under RF30, and it has been covered that TACOS or terms and conditions of service are relevant to it. But might those include things like education for reservists to support their performance in the workplace, and possibly joint career pathways for highly skilled individuals? I think this might fall under Admiral Jim's bailiwick in as a broad matter, but I might be wrong.
I'll take the second bit. I'll stay well clear of terms and conditions of service, because that's a minefield, and I'll leave that for my good friend General Simon. On the skills piece, absolutely. I touched on it earlier about some of the work we're doing in the engineering space, about how we can do mutually beneficial skills transfers between organizations. And we've done quite a lot of work looking at that under the Enterprise Approach project. And I think I'm just going to take this opportunity as well to something we haven't touched on, and I'm sure was touched on earlier in the conference, is I think the way in which we integrate with industry can provide us with a real input into improving our representation of women and underrepresented areas, and I absolutely believe that by better tapping into the skills that are out there, we can solve one of our problems, which is we're underrepresented in senior leaders, and with that lack of diversity of thought that then comes in, we're really not getting the best out of our workforce. And I see this move to us working much closer with industry as a real way of us addressing that and bringing in different skill sets, different viewpoints, which can only be good for us. And there's a real market out there for women in particular who left the service for good reasons, who've gone on and had really good, interesting, relevant careers, who we could really benefit from bringing back in, particularly in that mid to senior rank level and the senior NCO level, who bring a whole breadth of skills. And to me, this can short circuit the generational problem of people join at the bottom and it takes 20 to 30 years to get to the top. And that's one of the most exciting things that I think that can come out of this. So not a direct answer to the question at all, but I just wanted to make that point because it's something that we're really looking at and really wanting to improve. And this is a fast track vehicle, and I can see nothing but benefit from it.
John Simon, have you got anything that you'd like to say on, reserves, tax cost parity, or, which way that you might be taking terms and conditions of service for reservists?
Well, I think I'll leave that into into the future. But actually, we always get hidebound by terms and conditions of service, but actually they're pretty good at the moment. And you can use them for all sorts of different things. And I think it's partly the education piece about how they could be used and in an agile sense. So, but the point being, I think, with RO30 is the spectrum, how you get on and how you integrate and how you become part of the whole force. It shouldn't just be about reservists. It's about regular piece as well, as Admiral Jim has just alluded to, and how we can then interact with industry and business by that. And I think that the future, again, we're in privileged information here, but I think the future is looking pretty bright if we can get it right. And that's up to Adrian and a bit of my team to do that. Over.
Yeah, Adrian, have you got any parting shots on that issue of development of terms and conditions?
Yeah, I mean, look. So the short and honest answer is, it's too early to say. The review itself hasn't been published yet. We need to work through the recommendations in detail. But the logic flow to me seems to be, to not start with the TACOS and think about potential changes or not. It's actually to start with, what are the tasks? What capability do we need? What skills do we need? And what are the TACOS that flow from that to support those further steps up the logic chain? So yeah, it's absolutely going to be one of the general areas that we'll need to be looking at. But yeah, I'm afraid it's premature to say any more than that. Not because there's anything to withhold. We haven't done that detailed thinking yet. Over.
Thank you very much. That brings us to 12:18, which is my deadline to close the panel discussion. The Q&A element is still there. The staff will continue to attempt to answer your questions if you raise them, and we will record and take away the issues, and we can speak offline if you have any really burning issues. But on behalf of everybody who's joined the webinar, I'd like to thank all the panelists who are incredibly busy people for taking so much time out to address us. I think they've given us a really good insight, an inside lane to their thinking on emergent policy as we're coming through this dreadful pandemic. So thanks very much for those candid insights, and I'm sure that people will be much better equipped to consider the relationship between defence, industry and commerce off the back of that panel. So thank you very, very much. Hope you have a great afternoon. And